Welcome back, Monday, March 29th, 2021. I read a tweet this weekend that asked a simple question. Does Muhammad Anwar's life matter? Took me a few moments to figure out what was meant by that, and I realized Muhammad Anwar was the Pakistani immigrant, legal immigrant, who was killed in his Uber car. He was an Uber driver when two teen girls carjacked him in Washington, D.C. What was interesting to me is that for the past several weeks, we've read about, been told, lectured even, that Asian American hate crimes are on the rise. And it struck me, Mr. Anwar is an Asian American, but there was very little coverage of his death or the specifics around it, and very little information on the two girls caught on video who carjacked him. Indeed, as of even today, you have to work fairly hard to find that the two girls just happened to be African American. And my mind went back to the Atlanta killings of 8 massage parlor workers from 2 weeks ago. As 6 of those dead happened to be Asian American, we were given the catalyst for the anti-Asian American hate crime theme that's been so prominent of late. But then a funny thing happened on the way to the Racialization of Everything forum, a tragic thing. A week later, a mass shooting took the lives of 10 victims in Boulder. We know nothing of the race or religion of those 10, oddly. People early speculated on the race and the religion of the alleged gunmen, then silence. Why silence? Why did that story just idle and die? It was, after all, more deaths than happened or were taken in Atlanta, which got an awful lot more ink and attention. Oh, we come to learn, late, that the alleged shooter in Boulder was an immigrant from Syria with many social media posts supporting radical Islamism. So not all lives matter, is what we come to learn. Some lives matter, and they matter more than others. And I was correct, or incorrect, I should say. I was incorrect when what I wrote above was a tragic thing happened on the way to the Racialization of Everything forum. There is no racialization of everything forum in America. There is a racialization of some things when it comes to only certain races in America. But we learned from George Orwell, as we learned from the opponents of the Union in the mid-19th century here, that not everyone is keen on the notion that all are actually equal. Orwell put it that, quote, "Above all, no animal must ever tyrannize over his own kind. Weak or strong, clever or simple, we are all brothers. No animal must ever kill any other animal. All animals are equal," close quote. That's how it began at the Animal Farm anyway. Just as that's the theory upon which our country was founded anyway. It was even a commandment of the farm Orwell imagined and wrote about. As the founders of the new farm of equality there, however, in Orwell's book died out, and as memories faded and as a few things went less than perfectly, the old Equality Amendment gets changed to read. In fact, the entire Constitution gets changed to read, quote, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others," close quote. Old Abraham Lincoln was onto this long before Orwell, when a new party arose in America, a precursor to the KKK. It was called the Know Nothing Party. Lincoln was asked his views of that new party, and he responded this, quote, "Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we begin by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the Know-Nothings get control, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy, close quote. Who knew you could be so poetic in denouncing racism? Lincoln understood this principle deeply, however, that there is a human or natural tendency for those to proclaim for liberty and equality, but only for themselves. As he put it, I've never seen an advocate for slavery advocating it for himself. Or, quote, I have always thought that all men should be free, but if any should be slaves, it should be first those who desire it for themselves, and then secondly, those who desire it for others. For whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally, close quote. If equality is right for all men, it is right and true for all men. If it is not right for all men, try starting its rightness on yourself. The notion of equality, after all, comes from a rather strong origin here. Love your neighbor as yourself, or whatever is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man. It seems, as Lincoln and Orwell understood well, the tough thing is not starting with notions of equality, it's the keeping of those notions, the holding of them, which of course requires the continued teaching of the importance and value of them. Lincoln was speaking of this as early as the Dred Scott decision in 1857, pointing out how we started off with equality and slowly moved further and further away from it, saying, quote, in those days, our Declaration of Independence was held sacred by all and thought to include all, but now, to aid in making the bondage of the Negro universal and eternal, it is assailed and sneered at and construed and hawked at and torn, till its framers could rise from their graves, they would not recognize it at all. It is grossly incorrect to say or assume that the public estimate of the Negro is more favorable now than it was at the origin of this government, close quote. What might one say about the public estimation of race relations today when it comes to crime, victims, hate, attention, and concern? At best, we can say we are concerned about the crime and victims and hate and attention of some races, but not all. And until last year, you could hardly find a liberal joining the call to seek racial equality for Asian Americans at the baseline of the most important and classic form of racial equality enforcement, affirmative action, education admissions, and job hires and promotions. Indeed, because of misplaced emphasis on some races over others, Asian Americans were shunted aside in various hiring admission schemes to promote the hiring and advancements and admissions of other races temporarily more favored. What we taught here was that discrimination against some was okay, and discrimination in favor of others was also okay, so long as there was a consensus about those favored and disfavored classes or races. The fact that we are in a war, cold, hot, or other, or have resentments and complaints against the country of China has nothing to do with any of this at all. Asian Americans were facing racial civil rights discrimination in America for decades. If there was an uptick in anti-Asian American sentiment, say in the 1970s, because Richard Nixon opposed the admission of the People's Republic of China into the United Nations, nobody thought to make that connection because it would have been absurd. Nobody here acted out racial animus because of democracy's war against communism, and besides which, it would have been odd since Nixon was favoring Taiwan, the Republic of China, also Asian, over China. And today, I should say up until Boulder and the killing in D.C., nobody would have ever thought differently. But because Donald Trump was in a rhetorical and policy war with China, the liberal left effort, late to be sure, came to finally give a damn about Asian Americans, or say it did. But again, the absurdity. One cannot find much hatred of Asians or inspiration of hatred of Asians when one stops to consider that Donald Trump and conservatives generally were supporting anti-Chinese government protesters in Hong Kong over the last 2 years when we weren't talking about defending Taiwan. And it turns out, as these things conveniently or inconveniently work, Hong Kong happens, like Taiwan, also to be Asian. Maybe the NBA should be blamed for anti-Asian sentiment here, because they would not let its employees or supporters stand up and be sympathetic with the citizens of Hong Kong. One sees this absurdity rather quickly. As one saw Animal Farm's absurdity rather quickly, it took a fictional book to instruct us on all that. A civil war killing 5 times the number killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined didn't do it. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the speeches and sermons and marches of Martin Luther King Jr., they didn't evidently do it either. So we arrive at a very odd spot. After all this, where not only do we value some lives more than others based on race, but it turns out we value some deaths more than others based on race. Why do we not know the races, or anything, really, about the 2 non-Asians killed in Atlanta? In fact, why is the only thing we know about 6 of the 8 their race and nothing else? Why do we know nothing about the lives of those killed in Boulder, except that they weren't members of a certain race? Why do we know deep down why we no longer hear or read much of the alleged assassin in Boulder? You know who also got all this? It's a funny thing when you start looking at those that got this. They happen to be the targets of the woke intellectual class that wants to rid us of studying them and honoring them with statues and school names. So I give us Shakespeare. Would that students learned him again, or for that matter, Lincoln, or Orwell. Here's Shakespeare, Merchant of Venice. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated my enemies. And what's the reason? I am a Jew, but hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? Replace Jew for Asian with anything else the age gives you in that above line from Shakespeare, and maybe we can begin to get back to what we conservatives have been advocating for Asians for years, and that the left has fallaciously weaponized or tried to weaponize against us. Equality matters, and it matters more to us than you will ever know, at least with the pedagogy you peddle now. So I urge you, stop it. Please stop it. Lincoln should not have died in vain. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.